This is video script number 8. We're beginning with the definition of cognition, and in parentheses that means thinking. Cognition and thinking are both same concepts, but maybe you ought to get used to the word cognition and learn to substitute thinking for it, because in much of the material that we study from, they use cognition and not thinking. In trying to put this in a little balanced perspective at the beginning of our study of these things, we need to re-emphasize that Kurt W. Fisher is studying thinking skills, thinking ability, how it emerges, how it changes, various factors that influence it, and so on. Now, our reason for being concerned about this is that the evidence indicates that certain concepts, especially abstract concepts like principles, require a certain level of brain power in order for the person to think about them, to hold the various aspects of them in their mind and manipulate them back and forth to see what is changing, and thus gain insight into what the concept really is. This varies over age as a person matures, and varies even later in adulthood if the mind-brain complex has not been articulated, warmed up, structured with the tools and concepts and practices that enable the person to hold an idea or an abstraction in their mind and look at it and manipulate it and see what the implications are. Now, we understand that a person can do this at any age and developmental level, but the complexity of what they can hold in their mind varies a great deal. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about this thinking and thinking ability. And right now we're just going to try to get a little better definition of what cognition is. Reading from my script, according to this conception, cognition, that is thinking, includes anything that involves the person's controlling sources of variation, even when these sources have conventionally been called emotions, social skills, language, or whatever. All these various domains share the same processes of developing more and more effective cognitive control. Now, some of the key words in there, and I'll give you the citation on this so you can look it up in the guide and study it out a little bit and look at it as you're listening or afterwards. A person's controlling sources of variation. This means they perceive that something in this concept or idea in this area of learning is varying, and they need to be able to understand what the variations are and what the implications are. Now, they're saying that this is not just for language, but it's also in the emotional domain, in social skills. All of these domains we'll be looking at when we get into, my mind goes off in so many different directions running off through these domains, but we have one domain that deals with the internal structure of the mind, and we have other domains that deal with the culture in which we live, and also how people accommodate themselves to their culture. So all of these things would represent sources of variation in their thinking. This would be especially true when they begin to get some insight and have those aha moments that we've mentioned, and begin to reorganize and restructure their thinking so that they can take a new look at things in a different way. But it isn't just in language, but it's in emotional and social skills and so on. So prepare yourself to become acquainted with that. And if you need encouragement, think about how much more dynamic your interventions will be if you can take these things into account when you're preparing that intervention. I said in the very beginning, and have repeated often, complex problems require complex solutions. So as we move along, things are getting a little more complex. Anyway, here's a definition that I like. Cognition, thinking, is essentially what the organism from its own point of view can do, whether the doing is commonly classified as motor, perceptual, or mental. So they're thinking about their ability of how they can do something is important. Now, these three words, motor, perception, or mental, when we start really analyzing Fisher's skill theories, we'll find out that the human mind first operates on the motor level. This is in a child, where mostly it's movement, feeling, sticking everything in your mouth, various things like this. Perceptual comes as we begin to look out around ourselves and we can see concrete stories, concrete actions, things that can be observed and understood in that way. And then mental, we're talking about when you can take concepts, other things into your mind and suspend them there without seeing them or confronting them, just being able to manipulate them with your mind and take a look together and work with them. We'll give you examples of this as we go. Anyway, it says, notice that each specific realization of an action always includes both a subject and an object, an organism and an environment. In other words, the mind has to operate on something. You can't just say, I think, ergo I am, or something of that sort. Your thinking needs to be about something. And there are rules, parameters, and so on that involve that. But it involves the organism and the environment, and that's why we've said that the human mind is a product of the individual effort and the impact and help of the environment. Another thing they're introducing here, the definition of sets, has an important implication for the meaning of skill, scheme, and operant. And these are ideas from anyway, I'll get back to you when I can remember. Piaget, upon whom Fisher built a lot of his original theory, drawing out of Piaget. We will also give you some information on that. The definition of sets has an important implication for the meaning of skill, scheme, and operant, because an action always involves a particular object or thing. A skill must be specific to particular objects or things. Now, not to confuse you too soon, but these thinking skills exist at a couple of different levels. And the reason this is so important in teaching is that a learner may have a skill regarding some object or thing or subject and not have a skill in something else. For example, a person may have a highly developed mathematical skill and a very poorly developed social skill. So these things are not automatic, and they have to be attended to when you're creating your interventions. You have to be able to analyze what it is you want to accomplish, and then be able to create the things that will strengthen the skill sets in dealing with that particular thing. Now, this implication is equivalent to saying that as children develop, they master specific cognitive skills. They do not develop uniformly across the entire range of skills. Now, if you think of me in the classroom, I have students whose skills in social studies may be quite well developed, whereas their skills in other subject areas may be less well developed, and they may be struggling, or vice versa. You have a student that's very good in one form of academics, like mathematics or mechanics or something else, and then they'd not be very well developed at all in others. And so part of your interaction with your client is to assess this and to help them start filling in the blanks and being able to arrange their experience so that the mind-brain complex creates new neural pathways to accommodate this new level of functioning. And then, as they acquire facility in these different domains, they can begin a contrastive analysis and develop a much deeper and richer understanding of their world. So these things are quite important. Now, the quotation says the child masters specific skills, builds other specific skills upon them, and transfers skills from one domain to another. It says this mastery process involves qualitative changes in skills. In other words, there are more of them, or the ones they have increase in capacity. But the specific changes occur gradually, not abruptly. This is why as you administer an intervention, you need to be very sensitive to their zone of proximal development. Because presumably under your instruction and guidance, their mind will literally develop more and more capacity to consider the thing that you're inviting them to focus on. But this will happen gradually and not all at once. If it happens all at once, then that means you have changed that the level of operation of the mind-brain complex has changed. They've gone from a 12-year-old to a 14-year-old mind, or from a 14, 15-year-old mind to a 17, 18, 19-year-old mind, and so on. In other words, suddenly, things that mind could not do, with a little help they can do. So that means the mind-brain complex has matured. So here you are balancing two different things. One is these sudden changes, and the other is the gradual changes that take place as you mentor and tutor them, and as they progress through the learning to apply the thinking skills that they have. Okay, a task domain is a set of behaviors that involves only minor variations in the same task, in contrast to the broad grouping of behaviors across tasks in a skill domain. Within a task domain, there is virtually no problem in determining which behaviors belong to that domain. So, one of those deals where they can either do it or they can't. You invite them to perform a task, and if they can do it, then you know that that task belongs to that domain and it's within their capacity. Try not to get confused about these things, because we're going to give you a lot of real examples that you can use and think through to help you settle in this. But there again, you might want to go to the citation and do a little reading and pondering on this material. It says there is, however, one sense in which the levels are used. Each child has an optimal level, indicating the best performance the child shows, which is presumably a reflection of both practice and the upper limit of his or her processing ability. So this means that if you give them instruction and practice in a certain subject or skill, they will gradually increase, and then they will finally hit a limit beyond which they cannot go at this time, because their mind-brain complex is not sufficiently sophisticated, let's say. And this is where so much of our teaching gets lost. When we raise the standards without giving it any thought, we're just cherry-picking all kinds of ideas and philosophies and things and just throwing it at the child and expecting them to understand when they cannot. To be wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove means that you are aware of these things and that you can formulate their experiences in such a way that it accommodates where they are on both of these levels, both their optimal level and their current skill level, and that you can allow for coaching and increasing, so on. If you begin to think about the power in this, you might begin to be able to analyze the Savior's interrelationships with his apostles and with others, and see these things at work. It says, just as in information processing theories, this central processing limit increases with development. So this ability to process or use information, again, grows in stage-like situations as the mind-brain develops and opens up new neural pathways, and they're capable then of as thinking at a higher level. Although I have defined the optimal level as a single upper limit, there is a possibility suggested by ability research that at the highest levels a person may have a few different optimal levels in different broad domains. For example, an adult's optimal level in spatial skills may be different from his or her optimal level in verbal skills. So they may be good at some things and just not as good at others. And where they are not as good, maybe you can coach them up. But there may be some internal limits where you have to accommodate that. So to be aware of these things and know about them makes it possible for you to adjust your interventions just microscopically to center in on the exact needs of your learner. So these are things that will comprise our study. We'll be studying these things each and showing what material is in the domain and how it works. And I think I mentioned before that we're going to try to get to guided practice, where you actually have an opportunity to use these things and assess their effects and their usefulness and utility to you. So thank you for your attention today, and we'll talk to you on the next tape.